Alright, so I wanted to do a quick thing showing you how to render from multiple cameras at once with a single batch render, and then also just like the weird motion blurry sort of paradox frame that I mentioned to you guys. So I have two cameras set up in the scene. So I have camera 2, which is doing this weird pan on a lamp, which, full disclaimer, a student made. I am hijacking models right now, because it happened to be in my Maya scene. It's definitely more interesting than a cube. So we have camera 2, and then if we look at camera 1, to show you guys what that's doing real quick, so you guys have a better idea. So from frame 1 to 5, it's doing this sort of whatever motion. And then on frame 6, it immediately skips aggressively to the other side of the camera. So if we render this with motion blur, it should make some pretty ugly artifacts, so I just kind of wanted to show you guys that, is why I advise not doing that. And then from, again, 11 to 15, we're just going to swap to the other camera. So there's totally a way to do this so that you don't need to set up 8 bajillion, you know, if you do render and then render sequence, you don't need to do this every single camera cut because that will drive you insane. So, easy way to do this. Pop open to your render setup button, which is immediately to the right of your hypershade button. Alternately, you can find it in Windows, Animation Editors, Windows, Rendering Editors, and Render Setup. So by default, this is what happens when you've not touched this at all in a scene. It's basically just looking at where you have keyframes. This is just everything in your scene all at once. Actually, I lied. By default, this little doodle thing will be checked. So this is just, again, everything in your scene. You really can't mess with the settings of this too much. It's just sort of there. Anytime you make anything new, it's going to be added automatically to this. So what we want to do is go ahead and make our own render layer. So again, we basically just have this lamp and a light in the scene. That's the only thing there. Just for grins, I'm going to go in and add a ground plane here, because it makes me vaguely happier to have a ground plane. Which is super silly, but I loves me a good ground plane. And once again, my icon is doing stupid things. Alright, cool. So, to actually get this set up, we need to make some extra render layers. And basically what that is you can kind of group objects differently so that you can kind of select a render layer and render certain things and not other things, or render things with different settings. In this case, I'm going to mess with the render settings for each layer. So to make a new layer, just hit this little diamond plus button thing here. I'm going to call this camera 1. And then you want to go ahead and right click on this to create collection. This is how you actually put the objects in your scene. So by default, if we look at this, nothing shows up in the scene. Well, I mean the light does, and that's good, but obviously our objects are gone. So what we want to do is grab all of our camera stuff and our ground plane. I like to grab the sky dome light as well because it feels safer. And then just drag these and middle mouse button drag these all into this little box here, and it should add them, and then they'll show up in your render layer. So if you can't see it in your render layer, it won't render in your final render when rendering this render layer. Say that 80 times ever. But anywho, so you'll notice that I left out camera 2, and that's because this layer is only for rendering from camera 1, so I don't really care if camera 2 is in it. You can add it, it's not going to hurt anything, but I don't really need to, so shrugs. So I'm going to go ahead and here add another layer and call this camera 2. And then do the exact same thing I just did. Grab everything from here and here, and this time I'm just ignoring camera 1. Gonna do right click, create collection, and drag all this nonsense in again. So again, we have your different render layers. That is like 80% of the stuff that you have to do to set this up. Quick notes here, this little visibility layer just tells you which render layer you're looking at. So in this case, I put all the stuff for all of them in each camera layer, so they're not going to look significantly different. These little buttons here basically tell you if you are, if you're rendering for batch rendering, should I render this layer? So I'm going to turn this off for now. I'll come back and sort of explain that, but basically, I guess later, basically if you have this set to be turned on for your master layer, that's just a place in this particular scene for me to organize stuff. It's not something where I'm doing any active work animating with cameras, anything like that. So there's no real settings that I want rendered from this. So I'm just going to turn this off and then focus on my other render layers here, where I actually have dedicated camera setups and such. So this just, right now, I don't need this rendered, so I'm just going to turn it off. If you totally can render from it, I just don't need it, so you can, turn that off if you need to. Also, sometimes maybe you only want to re-render stuff from a specific camera, in which case, like, you could turn off camera 2, so you don't just waste a bunch of time re-rendering stuff. Alright, so to actually make this work the way that we want to pop into our render settings. And you'll notice that the render layer up here, in your little render layer thing, depending on what we click on and are viewing here, that was dumb, is going to actually change the setting here. You can also just manually drop this down and click it, and it'll, sync the buttons between the two windows. So I'll start with my camera 2, and I'm just going to be like, cool. In this case, that's what that was. Okay, this is the second time I'm filming this, because the first one took too long. So yeah. So in this case, like for camera render layer 2, like I said, I only care about camera 2 for this, so I'm actually just going to trash camera 1 and make that unrenderable. And then I'm going to go through and just be like, cool, this one I only needed frames 11 through 15, that's what I'm going to render. And just double check, I did want motion blur enabled, cool, just for that weird demo thing that I had. And everything else looks pretty much good. Cool. So, camera 2 should be configured properly. Gonna hop over to camera 1, and you'll notice that the start frame and everything else that I selected switched over. So if I updated camera 2, the start frame to frame 11, that updated in camera 1 as well. So what we need to do, obviously we don't want that, because if you change one setting for everything, it kind of defeats the purpose of having render layers, is right-click on an attribute and make an absolute layer override. And to be fair, I have tried an absolute and relative for this and not found a huge difference. So I usually just use absolute. But as soon as you do that, it's going to highlight it orange. Just very visually obvious that that's like an override, and it's also gone through and added, you can see this override for the start frame in here. I'm going to do the same thing for the end frame, and just be like, cool, you can stop rendering at frame 10. Huzzah! And then I can also mess with the renderable camera. So I'm on my camera layer 1. I'm going to go ahead and, again, make a layer override for this and do camera 1. Everything else should be good. I'm going to use motion blur in all of these, so that's fine. So I'm going to pop back into my camera 2 and just double check my settings. You can see that these are all the same things as they were before before I created the override. So just to be safe, I usually just make these overrides as well. That way, if I'm ever messing around in my master layer for something, if I change this to like 78 or something weird, it's not going to affect my layers without me realizing it and mess up my settings. So the only other thing I'm going to do is, once again, pop back in here and just nix camera 1, because I don't need that, and just create an absolute layer override for this. So you should be good to go, except apparently, oh, I'm dumb. Okay, that was weird. So, okay, I'm going to select camera 1 for this, make a layer override for it. I think when I deleted the other one, it deleted that one. They've sort of changed the way this works since the last time I had to do this. And question mark. Okay, I'm going to do a weird thing and just go into my master layer. I actually don't know why it's doing that. That's pretty annoying. Okay, we seem good now though. So we have camera 2 and camera 1, and that's really all I need. I don't care what's happening in master layer, so we're just going to leave that alone. Okay, so now, like I said, we should be good to go in and go into our render, pop into render sequence, and so you can do a few things with this. So to render all of the layers, you can largely ignore the frame range it says here, as well as the camera, as long as you have this all render enabled layers ticked. So this tick box, what it's going to do is look at and render every single layer where this little render tick box thing is blue. So in this case, it'll do camera 1 and camera 2, but ignore the master layer because that's not ticked. If this was ticked, it would render that as well. The other thing that you can tick, which I did before and I was like, what the heck is this all render enabled cameras. So in this case, that's not what I want. I just want to show you guys what it would do. Oh, all the salt. So remember when I had like the 2 renderable cameras down here? If you have multiple cameras for a single layer, it will render all of those cameras. So it'll basically render like frame 1 from 2 different angles, which maybe you want, maybe you don't, I don't know, but that's what that button does. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just leave all this ticked, and I'm going to go ahead and, I don't know why, so you should set your project when you're doing this. For some reason, it's ignored where I set my project and put it some other random place. So I'm just going to delete those folders and kind of go ahead and render sequence. And it should just go through, process your stuff, and then just systematically render out your whole animation. As it's doing this, when it starts saving frames, what are you doing? Are you actually rendering, or are you just being salty? End frame less than start frame. What have I done? Ah, yes. I'm trying to render, I think it thinks I'm trying to render from the master layer, so I'm going to go into a different layer and then try to, there we go. That was dumb. Yes, so don't put your render frame to 78. Start frame to 78 and your other one to 15. So you'll notice it's going through. It's rendering pretty quick because I'm rendering these really tiny. It's gone ahead and made a layer, or I'm sorry, it's made a folder for the camera layer. So whatever you name your layer is going to correspond to this particular folder name. It's just how Maya keeps stuff organized. If we click into that, you should see the beautiful renders that I have being generated. They're super ugly, and this is rendering from the wrong camera, question mark? Great. Okay, well, later problems. I'm gonna let this run and figure out what it's doing anyway. I'll probably just set something stupid in my settings. Either way. I think what it's actually done is probably trying to render from camera 2 for some reason. This is not a bad idea to just, like, sometimes I'll run a test or something just to make sure that it's actually rendering the correct frames before I set this down and just, like, totally walk away. But anywho, it's gone ahead, so it's rendered this, it's rendered all 10 frames for my first thing, for my first layer, and then it's made another folder for my second layer, and this is just how it goes through and does all of the frames. Okay, and here we actually do have some examples of ugly motion blur. But basically, and then if you had multiple cameras in here, like multiple renderable cameras per layer, it would add in, within the layer folder, cameras for each, or sorry, folders for each camera. So Maya will just generate these folders automatically. It doesn't care, doesn't expect you to do anything for that. But you can see again, so we've rendered now successfully from 2 separate cameras with a single batch render. I am curious though why it rendered, because it definitely was rendering from like a weird camera on camera 1, and I'm not entirely sure why it did that, but it's probably just like a dumb setting that I ticked somewhere that I didn't need to tick. But either way, that's how you set that up. That's pretty much how you set that up. So hopefully that helped.